Welcome to the Corporate Venturing Insider Series. Today is going to be special. We have Faran Nouri, who was a founding member, and managing partner of Lam Research Capital. Faran, would you like to introduce yourself and your journey into corporate venturing for the next 5 to 10 minutes?
Sure. Good morning, Nicolas, and everybody who's tuning in. I'm a fan of this series, and I'm excited to be joining the conversation. As for my own journey into corporate venture, as you know, there is no typical journey into the corporate venture world. Mine was probably even more meandering than most. I started educational-wise. I have an engineering degree, electrical engineering, as undergrad. In graduate school, I got interested in solid-state physics and physics of semiconductor devices. And after graduation, I joined HP Labs in Palo Alto. Actually, was excited to come to Silicon Valley, which back in those days there was actually some silicon in Silicon Valley, and as a device physicist, then spent many years as semiconductor technologies in different roles, always R&D roles. And I was very excited. I loved semiconductor industry because it was always the impact in the way we live was so obvious, right? There was a high impact industry, and I always thought the trajectory of my career was to become a CTO. But somewhere along the way, and many years in, I started wanting to have more of a business impact, felt that I did not have the opportunity to make business decisions, wanted a more exposure on that part of the world. And then, Moore's Law was maturing, and it was harder to get any, squeeze out more performance. And everyone thought the industry, people drew comparisons to how airplanes stopped getting faster and things like that. And so I reached a point that I decided to leave the industry, actually, and made the intentional decision pretty late in my career and against everyone's advice to go to business school. And I made the decision to go to business school full time instead of, doing a part-time MBA, really because I wanted to move that career behind and restart. I went to Stanford Business School, and post-business school, I started getting involved with a couple of startups, investing. And then in 2014, Lam Research was looking to start its corporate venture arm. And it was actually a perfect marriage of my deep technology background, my domain knowledge in semi-industry, with my new interest in startups and investing. So I joined Lam, and then we started our journey of starting a corporate venture. So that's how my meandering path into corporate venture.
Very nice. And clearly, Lam Capital invests in hard tech. Actually, maybe we should disclose we are co-investors together in Fabric 8, which is an amazing startup. So maybe we'll park it for later. But it probably means that your very deep technical background is very helpful for making investments. You understand the technology at a deep level. And so the question is, what are the advantages of that? But also, does it create sometimes bias where maybe you fall in love with the technology more?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think overall, if you look at the background of people at Lam Capital, they all have a very deep technology background. People on my team and PhDs from MIT and Berkeley, and I think that our industry is just so deep technical hard tech that you just kind of need that appreciation of the industry to be able to have good judgment about the kind of companies and what matters, what's differentiated, what's, however, also everybody in our team, most people have MBAs, but more importantly, they've actually been at startups or a founder of a startup or early, founder. And I think that's also, so we're not just technologists walking in with a technology background. You really need to have that entrepreneurship exposure as well, which is actually a hard combination.
So actually, let me double click on that, because that probably means that when you're recruiting, you're watching out for this mixed skill set. So can you walk us through how you build your team?
So building our team we're not a big team. So even more important that every person who joins this team is highly curated background, and I reached out to my own network, and people I'd worked at Applied Ventures or, a lot of my own network or CEOs of startups who had previously been in semi-industry. So those were the kind of backgrounds we sought. And I really do believe, even though it makes the recruiting really hard, that combination is just really necessary. It brings that my own exposure to startups and trying my hand at startups taught me that it's really, really hard to do, and just like I have this really healthy respect for people who do it, and that tenacity, that, I'm just realizing how hard it is. I think a lot of people don't realize that those overnight successes were really not overnight, And,
well, the sentence, overnight success takes 10 years.
Yeah, yeah, that's the overnight one. Yeah, exactly. Especially in hard tech, right? So I think that empathy and understanding what it takes, and being on that side of having received the term sheets is just so important. And that entrepreneurial mindset that you also need to bring to the investing as well. But we do require that deep technical expertise, just because our industry is so unique in many ways. It's hard to pick that up on the job.
Yeah, I concur. We're the same, and we still have an investment associate position that's still open after 12 months of looking for someone. So, and we had one position, the portfolio program manager, that took 9 months to find the right person. It can take a long time. Yeah. Something you mentioned also in your introduction was you wanted to have business impact, and that's what made you decide to go for Stanford. And tell me more about business impact today. How much do you feel like the business impact you have is so much more than any other journey you could have taken?
Yeah. So that's a really good question. Do I now have that business impact that I was seeking? And I think that it's been a long journey itself, getting a corporate venture group off the ground and getting to that point that impact is acknowledged, and it's I think probably the most challenging part of starting a corporate venture group, and because that business impact takes time. We talked about those 10-year overnight successes, so you really need. We had 3 exits last year, but this is 7 years after we started the investment, and some of them seemed fast, so it is a long journey to pay off. And even the ones that we invested to with the idea of developing partnership or developing a supplier, it took a long time to get there. But I think that so the first few years you have to live on faith, from and have people believe that you're going to get there and give you the time to get there. I feel like today, 7 years in, um, it's acknowledged that we are bringing value in many forms, in many different forms. But this is just constantly one of the challenges of corporate venture. Show that you are bringing that worth beyond the dollars, to the company.
And I think most VCs don't return funds until 7 years, if they ever return a fund.
Right.
So I think you're doing already better than most financial VCs.
We have been very fortunate, actually, financially, and from the beginning, I personally believe, just if for no other reason, for the longevity of the team, that we needed to keep the financial return in mind, even though that we were never we knew we can't lose money for the company, but we weren't started with the idea of bring money to the company. However, it always helps, right? If you, given the peaks and valleys of corporate venturing, strategic changes at the mothership, to have that longevity, I think it definitely helps to have those financial returns as well, to cushion you and have the money come back for reinvestment.
I like to think about it as you're going to be either perceived as a line of cost or line of profit.
Yes.
And if you have managed to do good financial discipline in your investments, you're going to be seen as a profit line, which is a very different conversation than a cost.
Yes.
And so, but there's another element which you said, you didn't use that word, but I think that's what you really meant, which is patience. You need the mothership to understand there is patience into venture capital. It takes a long time.
Yes.
But also, you had a change of CEO, which we know is a big change for CVC. So can you talk about the patience, and then what does that mean when you have a change of leadership?
So first, with the patience, I think really corporate venture arms live at the pleasure of the CEO. They, unless you are that top level, very top level alignment, that you're given some space and room to work in, you can't thrive. So, and with that, and that's tied to the patience too, the understanding that it's going to take time for us to see value out of the corporate venture. So in terms of the patience part, when we started Lam Capital, we actually spent the first year just thinking about it and benchmarking and talking to the corporate venture community and developing best practices and realizing that patience was required and communicating that we can't get into this game unless you're committing to give us some runway and wait for results. And then, so that's that piece of it. But of course, bringing money in really helps with that patience, makes people a lot more patient. And but the change of CEO, along the way, Lam Capital started to look at areas of growth for Lam outside of our core. And then we had a CEO change. With the changing CEO, our strategy changed too. When we realized that the new CEO rightfully really in retrospect, it made a lot of sense. Said that semi-industry is booming, our own business is booming. We are barely keeping up with the rapid growth in our own industry, and there are multiple macro changes for us to keep on top of. So why don't we look at our own space and serve our own ecosystem? So that was a really hard pivot that was very difficult. I mean, strategically, we just completely changed the strategy of the group and the skill set of the team members. So it was a difficult transition, but I think actually, all said and done, now that the dust has settled and we've done this hard pivot, it's made us much more relevant to the company. And I think that's another thing that you asked about business impact earlier. I feel like our business impact is doubling down in our own space has been much larger, much more appreciated, much more relevant to the company than investing in life sciences outside of our space. And, people saw us as not relevant.
That's very interesting. More tangible, because you can actually see the impact much more quickly and relate it directly to the, I wouldn't want to say short term, but right there strategy of the mothership.
Yeah. Even if it's not right away, but people see that it's aligned with our roadmap.
Very nice.
Or the industry roadmap.
So here I've heard two golden nuggets. So I'm going to go with the first one, which is you spent a year to design and to understand and to implement the best practices.
Yeah.
Most CVCs we see try to go very quick and make very quick investments. Tell us about the value of taking your time when you start versus trying to rush.
So some of that time was actually spent studying the strategic areas of investment. So we broadly studied where we would invest and where it would make sense to invest. But then also we did a lot of work on, we got involved with GCV, all the founding members, early members, going to GCV classes, networking with CVCs there. I reached out to many corporate venture guys, many of them on your series, the guys you've been talking, guys.
Amazing people.
And honestly, the sage advice we got and the openness, that people showed in, I remember talking to the guys at Untitled Capital, and they were just so open with us in terms of lessons learned and best practices. And, our industry is, even competitors and supplier customers, when it comes to their CVC groups, they get really collaborative. And I really appreciate that openness that other corporate venture guys showed us in terms of sharing best practices. And we were really, really beneficiaries of the industry's first decade that had been, I would say rocky in the sense of many corporate venture groups lasting a few years and disappearing, and a lot of missteps. And so we really benefited from that collective wisdom that the industry had gained that came to us through GCV and the other corporate ventures. And I've always been very appreciative of that openness. And then we implemented these best practices, which I think really, really saved us a lot of from a lot of mistakes along the way.
And I think when it comes to corporate venturing and CVCs, there are a number of bad actors or bad surprises for entrepreneurs. So it's not like the ecosystem had a good reputation, which means that if you make one mistake or two, you probably would not get the benefit of the doubt. So here, I think we can easily agree we should give a big shout out to GCV, which stands for Global Corporate Venturing, who have been really instrumental in raising the bar for the full ecosystem. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think at GCV, we've heard people talk about, I don't know what term they use, professionalization, or, and then I think you're doing that on the CVC series too, is like, let's bring up what those best practices are and sort of agree amongst ourselves that these are best practices that we want to hold each other to. And then as an industry have these, like you said, CVC used to be bad actors. Entrepreneurs were scared of going to CVCs. Institutional investors would say, "Don't go to corporate venture." But that's really different. I really believe that's changed dramatically, and it will continue to change.
Absolutely. Actually, you talk about the previous interviewees, including you. Most people say, how come you managed to talk to all these people? But actually, all of them have a burning desire to pay forward, to give back, to share best practices. It's just there was no YouTube channel to allow for this, but everyone I've invited have gladly accepted, and they want to share their best practices.
And I honestly have had people reach out. How many corporate ventures start all the time. This is an active, area, and people reach out, and I really do like to pay back in my case, because I was the recipient of the generosity, and I'm very happy to share our best practices. And I think it's really good for us as a whole to bring up that professionalization level and be, and I think right now corporate venture is now, we know it's becoming bigger piece of the total dollars invested, and I think this is going to continue.
And I'd like to think it's more than even dollar, which the proportion is increasing, but it's actually smart money where we can add value, which I come to. But I want to go into the second golden nugget, which was a pivot of your CEO. And I think this is the first time that I can double click on this, which is most people say CEO change is a risk for the CVC. And some people think it's because the CEO may not want the CVC. But actually, I think what you described is probably the real reason, which is the CEO is going to change the strategy of the company. And maybe the CVC will resist that change, or maybe will not agree with that change, or maybe will not embrace it. And here, what's interesting is that you pivoted as a company pivoted, so that your alignment stayed close to it. And so what I would like to ask is, how did you manage to communicate that change? Clearly, the pivot of the mothership was visible, but you have entrepreneurs who relied on your previous strategy. You need to communicate to the new entrepreneurs, but also the former entrepreneurs about this pivot. How did you manage the messaging to be just right?
With great difficulty.
Thank you for the honesty, because I can only imagine how tough it can be.
It was very tough. And I think you are actually right. A lot of times corporate venture groups do not survive a CEO change. And there was a time, honestly, that I wasn't sure we would survive it. And that is really because every new CEO has their view of the world, where they want to take the company. And the CVC may not fit in that strategy. And the more entrenched and bigger it is, probably it's harder to pivot. But for us, luckily the CEO believed in CVC in general, but didn't agree with the direction. And our pivot was very, very dramatic, from life sciences to semiconductor industry. We always invested in our own ecosystem, but primarily we were focused on life sciences with people who had that expertise. So that ended up meaning that the team changed and people left because they thought that there is no, what we ended up doing, we communicated that to our portfolio companies. In some cases, we still continued follow-on investments if it was indicated, but we did let them know that this is no longer strategic. We will try to remain good investors as, best we could. We had some life science investors stay and manage those portfolio companies, but over time we had that attrition out of the life sciences, and we started recruiting people with semiconductor domain expertise, which is very, very different. We couldn't really change those same partners into semi industry, and that attrition took place. That was another, disruption to the group, and then when we started looking at the new area, had to also message to the outside world that we're now in business for the semi industry. So I think that, really looking back, we did it as fast as we could, but it was a big hiccup to adjust to. And it took another, couple of years to really develop the portfolio newly in the semi industry. But the result today is, like I said, that I feel much better connected to the mothership than we were before.
Do you find, you was a founding member, you went through this big pivot. It's a small team. Do you sometimes find yourself as a startup inside the bigger company?
Oh, yeah, totally. And really completely, that startup. And we really can't, we're a big company, and we are, by necessity, have our processes, have our, the kind of processes that a large company has. And we can't move. We need to function like a startup and move at the speed of our startups. So, with all the companies that are coming to us from all kinds of changes that are going in the world, from AI and connectivity and all that, we just can't, we have to be really nimble and, have that startup speed, which is another way that having the group all having had entrepreneurial experience really helps.
Very nice. Let me ask a question, which is, I think, a golden nugget of what you mentioned, which is, even though you pivoted, even though some of your investments were no longer strategic and you made it clear to them, you would still follow investments when it made sense, which I think is amazing to do because it shows your respectful CVC to the entrepreneurs. But can you double click on when would it make sense, when it would not make sense? How do you make these decisions?
Financially, really. Always try to be a good investor. We continued the networking with our startup CEOs. If we could connect them to, at that point, we had developed a very rich ecosystem with our venture, in that case, institutional venture investors in life sciences. To continue to support them in fundraising, and if it makes sense financially, to continue investing. But no longer had that relationship of seeing, partnership or looking at strategic returns anymore.
Yeah.
In terms of follow-on investments in general, our strategy is, of course, if a company is highly strategic to us and we have a partnership with them, then, we will be more active as follow-on investors. But in general, we think about it as a financial investment and trying to do the right thing.
Very nice, which is best practice. So thank you for sharing that. I already know the answer because we're co-investor and I see the value you bring to the company we invested together. But can you share the value of being so much more connected to the mothership that it benefits the entrepreneurs, the portfolio companies?
Yeah, I think that, as you know, there's so much money out in the world, and good companies are always oversubscribed, and what we do as corporate venture that's most valuable to our portfolio companies is really our ability to either become partners in developing a new area, or um, developing supplier for us, or a customer. So that's the kind of value that our portfolio companies really see, mostly primarily in having Lam as an investor. There are times that we have helped develop the pilot line for a portfolio company, or we have helped with them developing their supply chain, and forming partnerships. So being closer to the mothership has allowed us to bring that kind of technical or operational expertise to connect to our portfolio companies, and having those development agreements, or in some cases business contracts, developing a supplier.
Yeah. I remember Ben Yu from Sierra Ventures telling me there are only two types of startups: the startups that need your money and the ones that don't need your money. And you want to invest in the ones that don't need your money.
I know.
And so part of that is, how do you convince a good entrepreneur who has choice of VCs, it's an oversubscribed round, to choose you? And it can't be about money.
Yeah, and very often right now we are in a deal that's highly competitive, oversubscribed, high valuation. All kinds of people in the ecosystem interested in it. And then how do you show? And we're not a particularly large group, so it is that connection back to the mothership, that look, if we come in, we're going to be able uh, we're a global company, for one. We have our footprint in many different parts of the world. We have our channels in many different parts of the world. So we can introduce you into those different parts, that different markets that you want to enter, and we have a presence. I'm speaking about a specific case, but those are examples. Or like the company we've co-invested in, the technologists at the company that can partner with you and develop a new area or develop a new market for you. And or in some cases, another case I'm thinking about, that we became a big customer for them. That here is an area you can have us in semiconductor industry where you weren't even going to look at semiconductor industry.
Yeah. Would you agree that the ratio of times you can invest in oversubscribed rounds is a good indicator of the CVC's ability to visibly and actually bring value to the portfolio companies?
I really think that times have changed, and the smart money, and you used that word earlier, the smart money is actually the corporate venture. That it used to be this stereotype of, dumb money be the corporate venture. I can't imagine how that, nothing could be further from truth, because we're the ones who really can do those kinds of deep diligence that only domain experts can do, right? And then we're the ones who can bring that, money is good, but, customers a lot better, right?
A lot better. Go to market. Or yes.
Market is a lot better. Channel to Asia is a lot better, or back to the US is a lot better. And so I think a lot of entrepreneurs realize that, and I think that's why I really believe this thing is going to flip about the role of corporate venture as smart money. And even today, we have an AI tool company that um, we were first investors in, and a lot of the guys in Sandhill, real good investors, were saying that there was no way for them to diligence this company because you have to go do this crazy POC and see if you can only do it if you have a hardware tool that you can test against, right?
Yep.
I don't care how smart you are, you're not going to look at that PowerPoint and decipher that. So that in those cases, corporate venture is actually first money, right?
Yeah. I mean, if you think about Playground Ventures, it's one of these best VC who have this amazing hardware and labs, but it would pale against all the equipment and experts you have inside Lam Research.
Yeah. In our own domain, any of us, right? In our own domain, we are those best experts, to.
So we just talked about strategic value to the entrepreneurs. How about the strategic value brought back to the mothership? How do you quantify it?
That's the hardest thing to add. This is the Achilles heel of all corporate venture guys, that quantifying the strategic value. And the way we do it, is we measure if we have a partnership with the company, if we develop some cases that we have been successfully checked the box as success items is when we have developed a supplier for us that didn't exist, a new agile supplier. And our supply chain is so important these days. So that's an area of investment for us, to develop nimble suppliers, all those pain points in the supply chain that we've identified, and go develop suppliers there. If you're successful in bringing in differentiated suppliers, that's a check mark. If you're successful in developing a partnership, we consider that a success. I mean, even before you have really realized if that market is real, which could easily take 10 years, but just developing that partnership already is a success, or if we always think about something is strategic to us if it changes the way we design our tool or manufacture our tool or support our tool. It could be remote, communication with our customers, or develop a new supplier or a customer, a new architecture, or new, those are all successes. And if we have JDAs, that's a success.
I see.
We've never acquired to date. We haven't acquired any company that we've invested in, and we don't typically go in, say, this is invest to acquire. But should we at someday acquire one of our portfolio companies, I would say that would be also a success story.
Well, that would be the ultimate win-win.
Yes. And developing a supplier for us has been definitely a win-win, where we have a case where we developed a supplier that's highly differentiated for us. They got access to semi-industry, where they weren't in that space. So that's a win-win.
So we talked about financials. strategic value to entrepreneurs and portfolio companies, strategic value to the mothership. Can you walk us through the decision-making process for you and your team on what do you consider and how do you decide to invest in a company?
Yeah, that, to develop our decision-making process has changed over time, and we keep adjusting that as necessary. But we started with a lot of the input we got from CVCs in terms of best practices. One of the things we have, which we didn't want to do, was having a big committee that required consensus of everybody and their brother to make an investment. And one of the things in our process of developing best practices that we heard was that corporate venture teams are really slow, And even though today we kind of do a lengthy diligence compared to institutional venture groups, I'd say our diligence part is much more detailed and lengthy and going to IP and all that. But our decision-making process is very streamlined. I report to the head of strategy at Lam, and she needs to be aligned with that. And then besides her, we require CFO's approval. So it's a very highly streamlined, and generally, if we have done our job, the CFO doesn't overrule us. He wants to make sure that he looks at the valuation. He wants to make sure we don't make dumb decisions. He holds the purse at the end of the day. But we don't have a big committee of various stakeholders at the company.
Well, I think you are one of the smallest I know of. So this is pretty good. And I think you are all co-located, which means you can meet face-to-face. In normal times, you could meet face-to-face.
Yeah, face-to-face like we're doing now. Yeah. Yes, we are co-located. We have actually two members in Asia, but these days we're talking all the time, and that decision between us and the head of strategy is seamless, right? She's my boss. We talk to her all the time, so she's coming along anyway with in that process. So it's really then getting it to the so by then you have the blessing of that it's strategic. We have already met the strategic fit criteria, which is the biggest hurdle for an investment for us. And then the CFO does the check on, did you put a right value on this? Is the valuation good? Why do you think you're not wasting the company's money?
Do you sometimes lead investment and price around, or you always have others to price around?
We do both. We both lead and follow. When we lead investments where we think that we are the experts and we are the best people to price that round.
Very nice.
When we are close, and by definition, that kind of means the investments that are really close to core, where we really are the experts, we understand that, and we really know how to price it. Then we lead that, and those are the ones that we probably take a board seat in those cases. But other than that, we're just as comfortable if it gets a little bit further from the core. We're just as comfortable joining the round, and then we like to take board observer roles in those cases.
So this is actually something very interesting to talk about best practices about board membership. Mm-hmm. And here it's even more critical because you just mentioned this is for the one you're very close to core. And this is where you take a board seat. And of course, the loyalty is to the portfolio company. How do you handle, in terms of best practices, these potentially two different pressure points?
Yeah, that's and our legal team really develops heartburn over that because What we have done, actually, we've introduced a series of training on the responsibilities of board members and board observers. And, we're a very conservative company with very conservative legal, and it took us a long time to get approval to take board seats. And then, when we do, we make sure we have, and we've trained everyone, people who take board seats and board observer, to understand their fiduciary and duty of care to the portfolio company. And we put firewalls between people who sit on the board, and of course the company needs to approve it too, and people who are in the, on the product side that may have exposure. And also that's partially to protect our guys from IP contamination as well. So we really need to be careful on both sides that there's no IP contamination. So really, best practices here are really, really important. That people who are on the board know what their responsibilities are. That board materials are not shared freely across the company. When in doubt, recuse yourself from the meeting. That's driven home, time and time again. When in doubt, it's best not to participate. We ask our portfolio companies to send board materials up front and give us heads up that if there is anything that's going to be discussed on the agenda that we shouldn't be participating, we don't. And when in doubt, ask the CEO of the portfolio company if this is something that you should not share, or so you really got to be careful with that.
It's so critical, and this could be the pitfalls that kills a reputation. So I think the key word is, when in doubt, ask, make sure you have really good legal advice, and make sure you're very explicit to the portfolio company, the CEO, about what to send, what not to send, when to involve, when not to involve.
In general, what we do is board materials stay within Lam Capital. There is no reason to ever share board materials outside of Lam Capital. If there is a reason you think that's in the benefit of the portfolio company, you have to get explicit approval to do that.
Agreed. Let's switch gear. Let's talk about how you've formed the fund. I know, because of previous discussion, it's an evergreen fund, but can you give some tips and maybe pros and cons about how you set up your fund?
It's what you want to do and what you get to do within a big company. What we ended up doing was setting Lam Capital as a separate LLC and allocating, essentially, in principle, money to Lam Capital in the form of running Lam Capital as though it was an evergreen fund. We invest off the balance sheet, but our practice is, we don't have to constantly go and beg for the money. We just have this allocation, and that we sort of reset every year with that allocation. And so that allocation is there in principle. However, we actually invest off the balance sheet, if that makes sense.
It does make sense.
So that's how we are structured. And I think that having evergreen feel is good for us, because the reason we're doing that is that we are strategic. We know these things are long horizon, so it doesn't make sense to be thinking 5-7 years. We think we're going to be doing this forever, and we need to reset that clock every year.
And let's move to reporting line. Clearly, when I joined the GCV for the very first time, before I even set up TDK Ventures, everyone was telling me the best of the best report to the CEO. But then the second best report to the CSO. You are reporting effectively to the CSO. Can you talk about whether you agree with these statements, but also what is the benefit to report to the CSO?
So I think I agree, and we did that. You did the benchmarking like I did, and I've seen. I don't know if you've seen some of the work coming out of Stanford.
From Ilya?
Yeah. He's done. He's done a lot of work on, and that actually speaks to the importance of corporate venture. That now Stanford offers classes on corporate venture and study of corporate venture practices and best practices. And his view is also, and he helped us along the way as we were setting up Lam Capital too. And in terms of best practices, being to CEO, because that at the end of the day, that connection, that direct connection, could be really good. But most CEOs don't want to deal with having corporate venture, which is heavy duty work, report to them. And I think corporate strategy is otherwise the best place, because we set our strategy to be as a strategic corporate venture arm. Lam Capital strategy is set to be aligned with strategy of Lam Research. So having that connection, and the biggest hurdle for us is strategic alignment. So that is just key to upfront clear that with the head of strategy, that this is strategically aligned, and have someone that has really broad view of where the company is going, right? They need to know. So some things may not look strategic today, but maybe on the long-term horizon of the company. And our understanding within Lam Research is that we have product groups that innovating every day. We have CTO office that innovates every day. We have tech scouting, but Lam Capital is the one that looks the furthest in terms of like how far in the roadmap we're looking at. So you need to be really connected to that strategic thinking inside the company. So I agree with that. And I've seen CTO office too. It depends on where the strategic heart of the company is. You need to be very well connected to it.
Very nice. So you mentioned Ilya. So Ilya Stribulov was my teacher at Stanford.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And the first class I had with him was probably a week after I started thinking about we should do TDK Ventures.
Oh, really?
And it was like a cold bucket, because he basically starts saying all the reasons why CVCs fail.
Yes.
And so in a way, it's not that he's actually telling you about the best practice. He's telling you about all the bad practice.
But, there's a lot to learn from mistakes, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, and that was extremely helpful, because if you only think about best practices, but you don't know the why, this is very difficult to connect and then implement. But if you understand all the pitfalls, all the failure, then the best practices start to make way more sense.
Yeah. I really agree. And I think, Ilya drove some of those home for us as well. And there's so many ways corporate venture groups fail, because, as you know, corporate venture groups are very diverse in the way they set up, and there are a lot of pitfalls. And for us, starting our corporate venture team, and maybe similar to TDK, we are beneficiaries of a lot of that learning in terms of what not to do.
Absolutely.
Just as powerful as what to do.
I think learning from the past is so important for what we do. And you mentioned about so many new CVCs are being created all the time. So we ran some statistics with GCV, and we found out that half of the investments received by entrepreneurs during the pandemic, half of them came from CVCs born during the pandemic.
Oh my God.
This is an amazingly big number.
Yeah.
It's hard to believe all these CVCs know what they are doing. Probably some do, probably some have great people that join them, but probably not all. And so I think that's why the GCV can really help us, all of us, as an ecosystem.
Yeah.
I remember one comment you made, which is GCV is also very helpful for therapy session.
Yeah.
Back to this bad practice, best practice, being able to share what we think should happen.
Well, exactly. I mean, it's not easy to do corporate venture. I mean, getting corporate venture group off the ground is I think very challenging, because you're in this mode of selling your value, and then at the same time you have a long time before you can prove your value, even when all goes well, and with all the pitfalls and the treacherous route. So I think those coming together, and just the sessions we've had at GCV really are just the openness of corporate venture community. Even when you're in industries that are not known for openness, once you get the corporate venture, it's like conversation flows in terms of what doesn't work, what works, how to get strategic value, how to communicate strategic value, back to the mothership. And there is a lot in the internal marketing and internal communication so those I find those therapy sessions honestly incredibly valuable. And also to know that you're not the only one
You're not alone.
You're not alone. This is not just hard for you. It is hard, It's a hard path. And what keeps us going is because we're constantly fed these exciting companies that get the juices going, and we stay in the game. But otherwise, it's got its challenges for sure.
Let's talk about the future. I have two questions. The first one is, where are you planning to expand? I think you mentioned Asia, so maybe you're planning expansion. And the second one is, where do you want to invest in the future, so that entrepreneurs potentially listening to us, but also CVCs listening to us, know when to partner with you?
So thank you for that question. We actually recently we have one person in China that heads our activities in Asia. We just hired a new person in Taiwan, and we are looking to develop the ecosystem in Taiwan around our customers. We want to go where our customers are. Our customers are very global: Korea, Taiwan, Europe. We are looking to strengthen our connections in Europe as well. Most of our team is in Silicon Valley. We love working with other CVCs, as well as institutional venture groups. I love this combination of the two. So we are looking this year to invest in them around us, and invest in agile supply chain industry 4.0, as we go to digital manufacturing, all the aspects of it. We invest in new architectures, new materials in the semi industry, what we call specialty technologies, not just the memory or logic, but other aspects of the CSI and connectivity, edge devices, and so a lot of different aspects of the ecosystem that we're investing in, and investing globally. We're looking to strengthen our global footprint, largely through collaborations.
Very nice. My last question: what are you most excited to invest in the next 6 months?
In the next 6 months, what we have, we actually are looking at a few companies in our own space globally that, semi industry is once again sexy again. And once again, we see money flowing in the industry, and new startups forming. And also the other thing is sustainability. That's another thing I didn't mention, but we're looking to invest in, and it's very exciting to look at climate tech as it applies to semi industry. And that's a new region that we would love to hear if there are entrepreneurs or investors in listening. That's an area we are looking to invest in.
Perfect. Faran, thank you. This was really an amazing conversation with a number of golden nuggets all along the way. Thank you.
Absolute pleasure. It's always fun to tune in and to listen to you.
Thank you.
Take care.